them, Wayana is a derogatory term, but for us, for the people of Tigray, Wayana literally means resisting to any form of subjugation and imposition, be it military, be it political, whatsoever. Any kind of imposition and subjugation, that resisting that kind of attempt is Wayana for me, for the millions of Tigrayans. So the Eritreans using this Wayana term, your womb should never give birth to a Wayana. They mean Tigrayan boys shouldn't be born in the future. So we have to destroy your reproductive body forever. That's so this nature, three kinds of intents of the genocidal forces have to be told boldly. That being said, what has been the role of Africa in the Tigray genocide? Africa has betrayed African women and girls time and again. The Congolese genocide, the Rwanda genocide, the Darfur genocide, and now the Tigray genocide. The so-called African solution to the African problems is a mockery to the people of Africa. It is rather a lethal weapon which the African dictatorial and genocidal regimes have been using to help each other by keeping the international community at bay, just pushing away the international community. In the past 2 years, the African Union, as well as the African leaders, turned a deaf ear to the unspeakable agonies of the people of Tigray when the genocidal regime of Abiy Ahmed and his comrades of evil have unleashed all forms of genocide on the people of Tigray. Where has been the so-called African solutions to African problems in the past 2 years? I plead with all African civil societies, rights activists, and especially women's rights advocates to come together and stand against genocidal and dictatorial regimes across the African continent for the sake of the millions of silenced Africans all over the continent. The IC betrayed humanity. Never again is an insult to humanity. It's a geopolitical tool, not a voice of humanity. The agonies of hundreds of thousands of Tigrayan victims of genocidal rape and conflict-related sexual violence couldn't be shocking enough to get the attention of the international community. What word other than betrayal can better explain such a tragedy? Hardships while collecting data regarding this genocidal rape in Tigray in the past 2 years, we had faced communication blackout, as you might know. So we couldn't get, we couldn't reach to as many victims as we wished to have. Victims exceedingly terrorized. They have been told by the perpetrators not to tell anything to anyone. So this psychological trauma have been occupied, their minds have been occupied with genocidal intimidation. So they wouldn't even speak enough when we get the chance to call to them. So they have been terrorized and they don't want to speak to tell the agonies they have been going through. An absolute loss of hope. They have no hope in the international community. So they ask me and my colleagues, so what? What are you, just this is pointless for us to tell you our stories. I mean, there will be no action, so it doesn't make any change, blah, blah. So they don't want to tell you what they have been going through. Loss of hope in the international community. The siege has crippled everything, especially the transportation across Tigray, and data collection has, faced hardship. Lastly, why do we Tigrayans mistrust the frameworks addressing the genocidal rapes or conflict-related sexual violence? We trusted the United Nations, especially the UN Women, to stand at the forefront of preventing genocidal rape from being committed in Tigray. Unfortunately, our trust landed nowhere. Nowhere, literally speaking. A very African woman representing the UN office in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia, has been conspiring against the people of Tigray and specifically against the hundreds of thousands of Tigrayan women and girls who have been at the receiving end of this genocidal rape. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, said Abiy Ahmed told me Eritreans are not in Tigray. When we have been telling him they are actually gang raping our mothers and sisters. So we have no trust in the international framework of addressing SGBV. The UN Human Rights Office of Human Rights miserably failed to stand up for its core principles in defending the rights of millions of Tigrayan women and girls, and failed in alerting the international community about the genocidal rapes that have been being committed in Tigray. To make things even worse, it joined hands with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, the very office that has been a tool of the Ethiopian regime in sugarcoating most of the genocidal crimes that have been committed by the Amhara, Ethiopian and Eritrean forces on the Tigrayan women and girls. So we Tigrayans are requesting for an independent investigation to all crimes, including the genocidal crimes committed on hundreds of thousands of Tigrayan women and girls, and in general, millions of Tigrayans, in the victims of weaponized rape ranging from under 10 to 90 years of age. In this regard, we strongly demand for the entire world, including the International Commission of Human Rights Experts to Ethiopia, to have access to Tigray and find out the bitter facts on the ground. With this, I end my speech. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Governor Maskal. It has been really insightful. We really do appreciate all the work that you've been doing, and we do understand, as members of the community, we do understand the very difficult hurdles that we have to go through to document and to monitor some of the reporting of sexual violence. It is a notion of sexual violence in conflict where it is very hard to actually gather empirical evidence. It's very hard to accumulate some of the testimonies that you hear, but people are too scared to speak out. And I think you really highlighted some of the key elements that we've been facing as the Tigrayan community and some of the hurdles that we still are going through. So thank you so much for that. I think it would be great if we could go to Christine next. Christine Ally has recently undertaken a leadership and advocacy for women in Africa fellowship at Georgetown University Law Center. She focuses her thesis on accountability and reparations for sexual violence crimes committed in Kenya during 2007 to 2008 post-election crisis. She's worked as the head of the Physicians for Human Rights in Kenya's office in enhancing prosecution and accountability for sexual violence in Kenya. She has also helped establish the Kenyan National Commission on Human Rights, the non-governmental Kenyan Human Rights Commission, and the 2005 Constitution of Kenya Review Commission. She's the co-founder currently of Utu Wutu Trust, which carries on support for survivors of the election-related violence in Kenya. She's also current special advisor to Transitional Justice, the UN Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan, but she will not be speaking on that. So we will kind of take what she has to say outside of that role. Thank you so much, Christine, for joining us. We do appreciate the fact that you're giving us some of your much insightful experiences on the work that you've done when it comes to transitional justice and also sexual gender-based violence and conflict, specifically in the Kenyan context. But as you can imagine, some of the frameworks that holds Kenya and Ethiopia, where Tigray is Tigray is in the north part of Ethiopia, it's quite similar because we both abide by the AU transitional framework for justice, and we do fall under IGAD, for example. So there's a lot of there's a lot of similarities there, and there's a lot of experiences that I think will be able to really, really help us, and we can learn from you on that. So thank you, Christine. And if you could just tell us a bit more about your work, what you've been working on when it comes to transitional justice, and what that looked like in the Kenyan context. I think your sound is muted, Christine.
Can you hear me?
It's still quite low. If you could raise the volume, that'd be great.
Oh, I thought having the headphones would make it better. Can you hear me?
Yes. Still, the sound is not great, but we can make do.
Okay, so I'll try to speak up if that's better. So I was just saying thank you so much, Melat, for that great introduction. And I feel really honored to be a part of this panel this morning and this evening, depending on where you're joining from, and to be a part of the panelists that are speaking with us all this evening. I will try to weave in my experiences from the Kenyan context with speaking to the background of the post-election violence and the processes that have followed thereafter, and also to share my perspectives in terms of the areas where we've had gaps and perhaps what could be done better looking to the future, especially as we seek to put together recommendations that will inform the upcoming PSBI conference. So very briefly, I'm sure that you're all familiar generally with what transpired in Kenya in 2007, but just to give an overview, we had a politically contested presidential election outcome, which resulted in massive violence across the country, in more than 1,000 people dead, more than 600,000 people displaced, and at least 900 cases of documented sexual and gender-based violence, with reports that were given thereafter estimating that there could have been victims in their thousands, many of whom did not come forward at the time. Thereafter, in fact, the African Union did provide a panel of eminent personalities led by the late Kofi Annan to mediate the peace process, which is familiar with what we are seeing in several contexts, including currently in Ethiopia with the Tigray situation, and together with former president of Tanzania and Graça Machel, who then helped to mediate a peace process that resulted in what we called the Kenya National Dialogue and Reconciliation Agreement. Now, this is what we then considered, quote and unquote, to be our transitional justice framework. It included 4 agenda items, which was set out first to ensure that there was cessation of the conflict. Secondly, to restore the peaceful engagement with displaced populations and provide humanitarian assistance to them. Thirdly, pursue accountability against individuals who are responsible for the violations. And finally, agenda item 4 set out what was considered to be long-term measures dealing with constitutional reforms, security sector reforms, and other aspects of reforms that were considered to be essential to then ensure that we did not revert back to a situation of conflict. So the conflict then lasted up until February 2008, when we had the cessation of fighting amongst political protagonists. And the fighting was actually ethnic-based, drawn along political lines of different ethnic communities affiliated to different politicians. Now, I think it's important to underscore here that this was not the first time that we had plunged into conflict as a result of elections in Kenya. It had happened numerous times in the past, but not to the scale that it happened in 2007. And as I will allude to later, it was not the last time that we experienced this type of violence, as we had repeat violence in 2017. Now, how did we then seek to address the election-related violations, and particularly putting our lens on sexual and gender-based violence? As I mentioned, A commission of inquiry was set up. We commonly refer to it as the Waki Commission, which was set up to inquire into the circumstances and those who were responsible for the violations. This commission, in fact, is the one that put together data from numerous human rights violations, health facilities, and a few victims that indicated that we were looking at a huge number of victims of sexual and gender-based violence, amongst other violations, as I'd mentioned earlier. The commission then proposed that we should set up a special tribunal that would investigate and hold individuals who are responsible accountable as for the violations as international crimes. In fact, the special tribunal then concluded that the violations had risen to a threshold of crimes against humanity, and specific actors within the political realms were responsible for financing, ordering, and facilitating the violations. An important caveat that was then put in the special tribunal's report was to say that if the state failed to set up the special tribunal, then the cases would proceed to the International Criminal Court. 1-2 years down the road, the government failed to set up a special tribunal. The International Criminal Court then opened 2 cases that included the president and the deputy president as individuals responsible for the violations. Unfortunately, both cases failed. In one case that involved the president, the state totally refused to cooperate with the International Criminal Court, and there was no sufficient evidence to proceed with the cases. In the second case involving the deputy president, a number of victims who had provided testimony recanted their evidence. A number of them were killed, a number of them went missing, and so both cases were then withdrawn. Fast forward, a Truth Commission was also set up, Truth, Justice, and Reconciliation Commission, that spent a significant amount of time from 2009 to 2013, speaking to communities that were affected not just by the post-election violence, but also by historical injustices. And its report documents 20,000 plus cases of sexual and gender-based violence committed in the context of political violence and other conflict-related situations. Sadly, to date, as we speak, the Truth Commission's report and all its recommendations that includes a comprehensive volume on the forms of reparations that ought to be given to victims who are affected, speaking to victims who bore children as a result of rape, victims who themselves are suffering from physical and psychological harm as a result of sexual violence, continue to sit in the shelves of the public, of the government, without any of those recommendations being addressed to date since 2013. At the same time, we had a new constitution promulgated in 2010 and new laws, including the Victims Protection Act, an International Crimes Act that seeks to domesticate the Rome Statute, but none of this were backward-looking. They were all forward-looking, and none was then intended to address the violations that happened in 2007 to 2008. The upshot of this entire situation is that the country moved on, but victims' lives stopped. The victims who were affected in 2007 have to date never been able to access, Sorry, was that only in the background? Okay.
You can continue, Christine. Sorry about that.
Okay. All right. So to date, the victims have not received any kind of justice, recognition, reparation, or assistance for those violations. In essence, what has then happened is that civil society organizations have had to pick up the pieces. And I would like particularly to mention a constitutional petition, which you can be able to find online. The citation of the case is petition 122 of 2013, which was filed by 8 victims of the post-election violence, 6 female victims who suffered gang rape during the post-election violence, 2 male victims who were forcefully circumcised during the violence, and what the case seeks to do in support by, together with the support of 4 non-governmental organizations, one of which I worked with, Physicians for Human Rights, as was mentioned earlier. The case was filed in 2013, recognizing the fact that there had been no interventions by the state focusing on victims of sexual and gender-based violence. We finally got a decision almost after 8 years on International Human Rights Day in December 2020. Unfortunately, the decision only partially seeks to address the harms that victims have suffered. It fails to recognize violations that were committed by non-state actors, fails to focus on prevention, or to provide reparations to victims. So by and large, victims have remained neglected. Now, I'd like to conclude by just giving a few remarks when we think about the transitional justice framework with that background in mind. I think the first question to ask ourselves is, who or what defines transitional justice frameworks? What is a transitional justice framework? How do we articulate it? And what we have seen in the Kenyan context, and certainly what we are seeing in other contexts, is that there is an overemphasis or focus on peace agreements as the basis upon which transitional justice should be pursued, and a failure to continuously hold states accountable for their human rights obligations upon which transitional justice mechanisms or goals are derived. In the absence of a peace agreement, states still hold a responsibility to effectively prevent violations against their citizens, to properly investigate and prosecute individuals responsible for those violations, to ensure that victims who are harmed are provided with adequate reparations, and of course, to look at long-term reforms that ensure that these violations do not recur. In the case of Kenya, once the special tribunal failed, once the ICC cases faltered, once the Truth Commission completed its work and it was filed away, then the society moved on. Then the African Union moved on, and the international community moved on. And victims have been left on their own to continue to agitate and fight for recognition, let alone acknowledgement of their harms and provision of reparations. And so the emphasis here must be that transitional justice is not merely what is documented in a peace agreement document. It exists in what the state's obligations are, and the international and regional community must accompany victims along the way until these rights are fulfilled. Finally, in speaking to the issue of state obligations, I think it's critical to then create the nexus between transitional justice frameworks as derived from state human rights obligations and contemporary processes, so that when we think about election processes, sustainable peace building, nation peace building, we cannot afford to ignore the plight of populations who have suffered from harm in ensuring that remedies are integrated within these processes. Unfortunately, what we are seeing world over is that once there has been a political consensus achieved, then victims become the forgotten part of the peace building process. And I'll just mention a study which you can refer to later, that was done by Physicians for Human Rights, UN Women, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in Kenya. The title is Breaking the Cycles of Election-Related Violence in Kenya, where we identify that the state's failure to pursue accountability against perpetrators of past violence, the failure to ensure that there are sufficient investments for rapid response to victims, has in fact continued to perpetuate electoral-related violence in Kenya, as we saw in 2017, for instance. And this also speaks to the need to ensure that a transitional justice framework feeds into legislation that is set up after time to ensure that crimes against humanity, war crimes, genocide, can properly be investigated and accountability pursued during post-conflict and also within the jurisdictions where these violations occur. I will stop here for now, and I look forward to continuing the conversation in the next phase of the panel. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, Christine. I really do appreciate the analysis you have provided for us. I think there's so many elements of what you've explained just now, what you've spoken about, that kind of feeds into the Tigray context as well. I mean, I know I said that before, but when it comes to, peace agreements, and can peace agreements really provide the transitional justice required for the victim community? And how do we take that transitional justice and feed it into legislation? And what happens when the state is the perpetrator? Can the state really be held accountable and be entrusted to have those legislative measures to feed that into the system, so that the victims actually do receive some type of recognition, like you said? So I think these are the points you've raised is very important, because I think most of the times, a lot of Africans, we've really resorted to kind of going to the AU for elements of transitional justice, for peace agreements, and there has been a lot of trust building going on as a continent, and we are getting there slowly. But when it comes to the victims now, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with ensuring that the states that have really committed atrocities against their civilians, how do we hold them accountable? Especially when we've seen so many times in the regimes of African regimes that they are the lawmakers and they are the ones that will hold anyone accountable. So how would they hold themselves accountable? So that is the question, I think, in the Tigrayan context as well. We have recently signed a peace agreement with the Ethiopian government, which mentions transitional justice, interestingly, but it constitutes that to the internal system of the country, the federal constitution. And may I point out, it's the reason of the failings of the federal constitution why we're in this situation in the first place, why we have victims of sexual gender-based violence systematically being targeted by militaries that the Ethiopian government and the Eritrean government are accountable for. They are running these militaries that are conducting these sexual violence atrocities. So it's really an obstacle that I think we all have to overcome together, because it seems to me that there is a lot of stark similarities between some of the stuff that you've kind of mentioned. And thank you so much. And I'm sure we have questions for you later on from the audience, and probably for myself as well. So thank you so much, and we'll get back to you through the question section. We've got Dr. Sela Myoka Musendi next. Dr. Myoka, I know you've got a lot of network issues, so if you're able to speak, it'll be really good. Can you just let me know that you are able to speak and your network is working accordingly?
Yeah, I mean, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. I think it's working okay now.
Okay, great.
All right, thank you. Can I go ahead?
Yeah, so I'm just going to introduce you. So Dr. Myoka is an independent gender
Hello.
consultant.
Can I go ahead?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, but you kind of break off every few seconds.
Okay, so I'm just going to do your introduction, and you can go ahead with some of the points that we have for you for today. So Dr. Myoka is an independent gender consultant and a researcher based in Nairobi, Kenya. I know you said you have some storms in the evenings, hence some of the connection issues that we're facing. Her research interests include the lived experiences of women and children in situations of armed conflict in East Africa, stigmatized identities, STIs amongst many. She earned her PhD in cultural studies and education at Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. She has a graduate certificate in women's sexuality studies. She has written various opinion pieces. You guys have probably, anyone who's engaged with the Tigrayan conflict right now has probably engaged with some of her pieces that she's written regarding sexual violence as a tool of war and the ongoing conflict in the Ethiopian's Tigray region. So Dr. Myoka, thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate your time. And I think your experience, especially in the context of, you do have the opinion pieces that you've written were very insightful on the sexual violence being used as a weapon of war in the Tigray context. How do you define some of the things that have been going on in Tigray from your perspective, from someone who has been observing and has been doing a lot of research on the topic, and you've also written pieces? How do you observe the use of sexual violence as a tool of war in the conflict? We may have lost Dr. Miyoka, maybe for a tiny bit of time. She might rejoin us. So maybe we'll go to Rita, and then we can come back to Dr. Miyoka as her connection allows. So Rita, are you there? Hi, Rita.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Oh, we love your hair, by the way. This is the cultural Tigrayan hairstyle.
Thank you.
So Rita Kasai, she's a part of the Tigray Youth Network. She is also a member of the Omna team and also Irob Anina. She has been working since the beginning of the war to advocate for some of the victims of sexual violence and also other atrocities in the Tigray region. She is now in Sudan doing some research, conducting research on various topics, some which include collecting testimonies on sexual gender-based violence. I think of victims who have who are IDPs, who have been forcibly removed from Western Tigray by some of the Eritrean, Ethiopian and allied, specifically Amhara regional forces. There has been documentation of the ethnic cleansing that has taken place in the region in Western Tigray specifically, and as many as over 73,000 refugees are now in Sudan in camps, in really, really grievous conditions, I must say, really dire conditions. They have been facing many challenges. Starvation has been predominant in the camps. Also, there's the question of safety. So they do have a lot of obstacles to overcome. But on top of that, some of these refugees are actually victims of sexual gender-based violence, as they were forcibly removed and as other crimes was committed upon them and their population and their community in Western Tigray. So Rita, thank you for joining us today. I know you've conducted quite a lot of work in Sudan, so if you're able to, could you please fill us in about the conditions of women in Sudan and the rampant sexual violence that has been bestowed upon them before they arrived into the camps and the way that they are dealing with it, and what psychosocial support, if any, if they're receiving any, and what needs to be done, and I know there's a lot of questions, but what are the gaps? Thank you, Rita.
Thank you, Milat, for putting this together and for having me on to highlight some of the work that we do as TYN. And thank you to the panelists who have spoken so far. I'm going to maybe repeat and re-emphasize some of the stuff that Gabra Meskel mentioned earlier, just to highlight the gravity of the conflict-related sexual violence that took place in Tigray. So it may have been said already, but around regional research suggests that around 120,000 women are supposed to have been made victims of conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray. Conservative estimates from the UN Population Fund suggest that at least 26,000 Tigrayan women sought medical care for conflict-related sexual violence in Tigray in 2021. This is probably a significant underestimation because of the lack of information coming out from that region. Survivors and witnesses have shared that Ethiopian, Eritrean, and Amhara forces have systematically perpetrated conflict-related sexual violence as a weapon of war in a way to destroy the Tigrayans. Tens of thousands of Tigrayan women and girls have been subject to not just rape, but gang rape, sexual slavery, forced impregnation, enforced sterilization, which are all atrocity crimes that we believe were acts of genocide. So these attacks were also made on tiny ethnic groups, namely the Irob and the Kunama. The Irob, who are only 33,000, are in a geographically very vulnerable area, and the Kunama, who only have a population of around 10,000. One particular Irob victim was held in sexual slavery in Eritrea. When she decided to flee her perpetrators, she fled through Ethiopia, and while fleeing, she was raped again by Ethiopian federal forces. So from this, we can see the rapes are not just random attacks of like vulgar, sick, extremely cruel individuals. They were systematic, the dehumanizing words that these perpetrators used while abusing the victims, like "where is Wayane now?" To save you, and the locations that these perpetrators conducted the rapes, like churches and open spaces in full view of their family members, suggest that it was made to destroy this ethnic group, and it was done systematically. So in terms of the work that TYN has done, we've done several articles about conflict-related sexual violence. We've written letters to the relevant stakeholders about it. Salam and Madi from TYN have also done various lives on Instagram, things like that, to raise awareness on the matter. We've also organized parliament events where we've had Ethiopian ex-ministers, namely Fulsan Mohammed, who was there during the conflict and came and said that the government troops had used rape as a weapon. And we've also done like webinars like this one to highlight the abandonment that the Tigrayan women have been going through the last 2 years. So I'm not sure if you remember, a Rwandan survivor came to highlight the agony that she was still going through now after being raped during the Rwandan genocide. So, and we've still not had a single African state actually address any of it. So, yeah. So to address the topic of this webinar, highlighting the gaps in the frameworks that we use to deal with the prevention and justice around sexual and gender-based violence and conflict. As you said, Milat, I've been in Sudan for the last few months and spoken to some of the survivors, and I've spoken to doctors who've had to take sharp objects out of women's sexual organs, and all of them have had journalists, human rights organizations go there, speak to them, traumatize them, re-traumatize them. They've had phone interviews, and lots of people speaking to them, and these victims have had to sell their trauma, and without any result, without anything actually coming from these interviews and things like that. They've not had any human rights lawyers or anybody go there to speak to them about post-rape assistance or justice. So these women in Sudan are, they're just living there with everything that has happened to them. And on top of that, they're in a very, very unsafe, vulnerable situation in the camps, where they're, again, vulnerable to abuse. Women in the camps have been, again, victims of sexual violence inside the camps, and are not able to report to the local authority for fear of being attacked again, which it has happened while they're in the camps. So a lot of these women are in a better place, as we know, compared to the women in Tigray who don't have any medical assistance, who don't have enough food to eat, who definitely have no access to justice and accountability. As Melat said, the peace agreement was signed in Pretoria on November the 2nd, and since then, I've received testimonies from victims of rape in newly occupied areas, one particular victim stated that 3 Prosperity Party soldiers had raped her while she was 3 months pregnant. So, as Tina said, signing a peace agreement is not enough, and we need independent parties and international institutions that are designated to protect and promote human rights to come and fully verify the implementation of peace, so that these women, at the very least, can have something to eat and not fear for their lives after bearing such horrible atrocities. To speak more on some of the stuff that the women are going through in Sudan, there are women, well, girls as young as 14 who are forced to sell their bodies to make money to eat. There are children not going to school. I know one particular 7-year-old who isn't allowed to go to school because she fears being trafficked, because she had been trafficked previously and her dad managed to return her. There are women who, again, are not able to get any protection after being victims of sexual violence in the camps. So Tigrayan women are suffering in every single way, and there has been nothing done in terms of justice and accountability. I think I'm going to stop there, Melat, and let me know if there's anything else that you need me to cover. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rita. I really do appreciate all the hard work that you've been doing in Sudan, generally in advocacy, but also specifically now just highlighting some of, like Gabra Meskel, some of the obstacles that women of Tigray have to go through, even outside of the region. So it is something that has been inflicted upon them based on their identity, based on their ethnicity, rather than where they are located. Even when they are outside of Tigray, they are facing grievous harm. So thank you so much, Rita. I do appreciate your time. I think Dr. Mioka is back with us. If you could just give me a shout if you are.
Yes, I am. I'm right here.
Great.
I'm right here.
Great, thank you. Good to have you back. So I've done your introduction, so I think everyone knows who you are. So just to kind of get to some of the topics that I think that you can share with us that might give us a bit more of insight. So in a recent piece that you've written about on Tigray, you wrote, within the context of the foregoing definition of the term genocide, we can argue that the sexual violence being meted out on women and girls in Tigray qualifies as genocide or rape, given that some of the survivors of this violence have suffered severe injuries leading to infertility. So this is a very strong statement, because this is exactly what we have been saying for the last few years, because right from the beginning of the war, we saw elements of the government forces and allied Eritrean and Amhara regional forces condemning the women to infertility, to making sure they can't bear children, to infections of like STI, HIV, other kind of diseases. So the deliberate and systematic manner in which they were inflicted with such diseases and even unwanted pregnancies showed that there was a deliberate act coming from these soldiers. Therefore, the intent to destroy their ethnicity was there, which is why it was very early on when we started saying Tigray genocide, because the intent, if the intent is clearly visible, then the actions only accumulate and they happen as a conflict unfolds, but the intent has been there. So can you just shed some light around this statement, and how does this tie into some of your experiences maybe in wartime Rwanda and other contexts in the African context? Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm very, very grateful to be here, to be able to share this platform and just basically have this very critical conversation about the ways in which women and children in Africa continue to bear the brunt of war and genocide. I think we all know by now, those of us on this platform know by now, that there's really a tension around admitting when genocide is occurring on this continent. I mean, everyone wants to redefine what a genocide is. And even when it fits the UN definition of genocide, you have people feeling very uncomfortable about calling it as it is, because if we call it genocide, then it means as state actors and others, other key stakeholders, we must take action. And I think that has been one of the challenges. If I would think about one of the challenges that AU and the United Nations face is being able to really call out some of these atrocities as they are openly, because I think that it makes people uncomfortable, but the uncomfortable truth has to be told. So I want to start by really talking about generally what's going on in Africa right now. We are discussing Tigray, but I would like us to integrate a little bit of a conversation around what is going on in the DRC, in the eastern part of Congo, where women and children and the elderly and sick people are all being disrupted because of the war that is going on there. You also have a lot of suffering that is going on in Tigray as well, as we know this. A lot of women and children have suffered enormously the last 2 years since the conflict began. And we know that people who have been uprooted from their homes have had to flee into neighboring countries like Sudan. And right here in Kenya, in Nairobi, we have a lot of our brothers and sisters from Ethiopia who have had to come here just to find refuge. We have conflict going on in places like the Central Republic, the Central African Republic. You know, we have conflicts going on all over the continent, really. And women continue to bear the brunt of this conflict, women and children. And if I may just share some statistics, about 350,000, between 350,000 and 500,000 women are said to have been raped during the Rwandan genocide in '94. I've also come across some statistics that suggest that up to 500,000 women in the Congo have suffered from rape or some other type of sexual violence. I mean, if you read up on the work of Dr. Denis Mukwege, I believe it is, from Panzi Hospital in the DRC, he writes about this. He's a Nobel Peace Prize winner. He won this award in 2018 because of his work around, just not just propagating for the rights of women in the Congo, but he has done a lot of constructive surgery on children, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds, 6-year-olds, women, for being defiled or raped or just basically gang rape. These are some of the atrocities that have happened here in Africa, in Congo, in as you know, in Tigray, in so many places on the continent. And you wonder, because we have, as we talk about even these instruments that AU and the UN have, we really need to ask ourselves, how effective are these instruments in terms of really protecting women? You know, it's good to have documents on paper, but when we come down to the reality on the ground, we need to be very honest as researchers, as human rights activists, everyone that is concerned, and even just ordinary everyday people, we need to come down to some seriousness. You know, we can't just write documents and reports every year. We need to see how these reports inform action. I think that's very critical. Personally, I feel for the women who are suffering enormously. I've written some pieces. I mean, if you look up at Kujenga Amani, it's a platform that is set up by the Social Science Research Council in the United States. They provide a platform for African scholars to write on conflict in Africa, and they've done a very excellent job at trying to highlight what is currently going on the continent. And I would urge all of you to visit the page, not just read my work, but also the work of a lot of my colleagues who have posted a lot of research that's being done even on Boko Haram in Nigeria. So we know that there's a crisis on the continent, and we also know that women are the primary target, women and children. And so how do we get our leaders, our African leaders, to understand that this trend must stop because it's been going on for a very long time? What can we do better to create an environment where women are not constantly the target in wars that they have nothing to do with? You know, very often women are just being subjected to violence because of some other reasons that have nothing to do with their participation in these conflicts. So that's something that really has to happen. I was listening intently to Rita's presentation. It breaks my heart to hear that, you have researchers and others who've been going there and collecting information and data from victims of this violence in I don't know if it's at the refugee camp in the Sudan, the Tigrayan women, and just basically re-traumatizing them. I think that there has to be a point where even as scholars, we check ourselves in our positionalities. If we are not able to provide protection and safety for victims of these types of violence and atrocities, I think we would do well not to re-traumatize victims by basically getting data out of them in a place when they are so vulnerable. I think that is something that needs to be, we need to look into this. This is really wrong, and we need to call out our scholars everywhere on the continent and all around the world to know that this is not proper practice. This is not proper research practice. This actually contravenes every kind of, every kind of ethics that anyone could think of. Even the ones that would approve this type of research, the committee members who would sit to approve this is just really outrageous and wrong. I have to call that out. But having said that, seeing as there's still a high prevalence of violence being meted on women and children on the continent during situations of war, we also need to urge the African Union and the United Nations to really do better and to do more, to listen, first and foremost, to listen to women. And we need more women at the table so that our voices and the voices of those victims can be heard. That I think is very critical in terms of just looking at what needs to be done. I was trying to review the question of the framework, the continental results framework. And one of the things that I thought I could just bring up in terms of the pillars, the pillar on prevention, one of the indicators they discuss has to do with the number of sexual and gender-based violence incidents against women and girls. And the indicator is supposed to assess essentially how many reports of these cases are there, and then also look at how many of the reported cases have been acted upon, and really how many have been concluded. And I thought maybe this is something that I could just discuss a little bit and somebody else could chip in if they want. In terms of the numbers, when we look at Tigray specifically, like in any other case, whenever there is war, it's difficult to establish the exact number of victims of sexual violence, or let me say survivors as well. But I know that it's a large number. And I remember from the very beginning when this conflict began and women began to tell stories of having been raped, I do remember very well that there was really just a group of people who came out online, and they were on the social media platforms, and they were saying that this was not true. So I feel like, I don't know, I stand to be corrected, but I feel like it took some time before the AU and the United Nations actually responded to say it is true that women have experienced sexual violence within this ongoing conflict in Tigray in the early months when this was going on. And so this to me was really disturbing, because it's just the usual strategy where women's pain is basically erased. And I remember that there was just a lot of vitriol going on online. Anyone who tried to suggest that women were being raped, they just came after you, attacked you. And so we know that in this case, women tend to be vulnerable in this way. And anyone who tried to advocate for women's protection at that time really just was at risk of being attacked online. So the AU and the UN and other institutions that are trying to protect women must do more to make our experiences more visible. And I feel like there has to be a kind of courage. I don't know what word to use, but I feel like there has to be a kind of courage where our leaders, our African leaders, have the guts to just stand out and speak it and tell it as it is. Because we cannot witness suffering, know that there is suffering, and just be quiet and keep quiet and wait for the West to come in and start saying something is wrong before we also start to say something. I feel like our leaders need to just, just need to stand up and tell the truth and just be bold. This is what we need. Because without being bold and taking an action and speaking out against these atrocities, I think that, women will continue being targeted, and I feel like that's not right. I wanted to also say that we continue to urge for the cessation of hostilities. We hope that we will see peace restored to Tigray, and we also hope for the same in the eastern part of DRC. We hope that in these two instances, that peace will prevail, and all the actors involved will hold their guns, will silence the guns, so that some sense and reason can prevail. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miyaka. That was really extensive and thorough, and there's a lot of bones to pick from that. So we definitely have to have a bigger conversation about this. And all the panelists, I think, have shared so far amazing, insightful kind of notions of where they come from, their expertise. So I think that's definitely something that we have to also take outside of this panel and work together for some of the things that we're working on independently. So thank you so much for that. I'm sure we'll come back to you for the question section. And thank you for our audience for still being with us. We are now going to go to Ragnhild. Ragnhild, if you're here, if you can just confirm.
Hi, I'm here.
Great, thank you so much. Ragnhild is joining us today, and thank you so much I know you have a busy schedule. She's actually an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan and a faculty associate at the Center for Political Studies, Institute for Social Research. She's also a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute of Oslo, Norway. Professor Nordaas has a particular interest in understanding the causes, dynamics, and consequences of conflict-related violence. She's also one of the co-creators of Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict Dataset, SVAC. So the Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict Dataset is one of the most comprehensive and widely used global data on sexual violence in war. It has recently been updated and now covers all armed conflicts in the period of 1989 to 2019. I don't know if that date is to be corrected, but that's what I got from it. An interesting find about the SVAC database is that it has identified that state militaries are more likely to be reported as perpetrators of sexual violence than either rebel groups or militias. Professor Nordaas, thank you so much for joining us. Maybe you can go into explaining what the database is about, the dimensions it captures, what your views are on the documentations of data when state militaries are actually the perpetrators, and how this database can actually help enhance transitional justice, and how it can influence policymakers and legislation to support the victim communities.
Thank you so much for inviting me to present here, and also for the wonderful work that you're doing to put the focus on the situation in Tigray and the problems with sexual violence. In many ways, in my research, I kind of take a step back from looking only at individual cases in isolation, and try to contribute something by establishing broader patterns across time and space. So when I started first working on sexual violence now more than a decade ago, there wasn't really any systematic overview of where is sexual violence taking place in war, who are responsible for it, what are the patterns, and when you don't have that sort of baseline overview across conflicts, and then you're also you don't have a strong basis for making assessments of why it is happening certain places and why it's not happening other places. So in many ways, we are facing so many challenges in trying to study sexual violence in a systematic way with empirical data. And many of the things that have already come up in the speeches so far in this meeting really also highlight that. So I will not be able to go into all of those, but this is truly a very difficult topic to study. The data challenges we're facing are tremendous. And so we need to recognize that. And I also very much recognize that what I can contribute and what the people that I work with on the sexual violence and armed conflict database can contribute is only one small part of the picture. Because it is impossible, I would say, at least for now, to establish specific statistics of exactly how many victims or survivors of sexual violence there are across all conflict and across time, or how many perpetrators there are, or how many incidences of sexual violence are actually taking place. These will all be estimates, and estimates based on data that is often biased, often has a lot of missingness and a lot of underreporting. So we always have to think about those challenges when we make generalizations about sexual violence in war. And to always be conscious about, whenever you hear a statistic of the number of victims or survivors, to always consider the large uncertainties around such estimates. Now, one of the things that we've really established with the Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict database is that there is a lot of variation when it comes to sexual violence in war. There are places where it happens to a very large extent, where it is clearly part of the logic of war, where it's strategically implemented. Some few cases, we also see that it's being ordered. In many more cases, it is a practice that is being established where it's not necessarily ordered, but it's tolerated by commanders. And then some cases is also opportunistic violence, because when conflict breaks out, there are the legal systems that should normally work in peacetime are not fully operational in the chaos of war. Some people will take advantage of the situation and commit acts of violence, including sexual violence. So, but we do see, and we have documented cases where specific armed actors do not commit sexual violence hardly or at all, which is important to notice, because by extension, it means that sexual violence is not inevitable in war, and those that it is something that can be restrained and can be controlled. And so that means that those who are choosing to commit acts of sexual violence in war should be held to account. I think previously we thought that this is something that happens always in war. If there's a war, there will be sexual violence. And to some extent, that is true, but it's not. But this variation that we see really needs to be explained and really needs to be acknowledged. So we shouldn't just sort of say, oh, it's war, so it's typical, this will happen, and sort of leave it at that. We definitely need to monitor and document this variation, to also know why is it not happening in certain circumstances, and can something be learned from that? You said already that states are very often perpetrators of sexual violence in war, and that is one of the other main findings from the Sexual Violence and Armed Conflict database. We are going through, we use three main sources for our data, for the data that we collect. We use the US State Department, we use Amnesty International, and we use Human Rights Watch information. So there's a lot to be said about that, but those are the sources that go into our specific database. We see, using those reports, that states are very often perpetrators of sexual violence. So where we previously perhaps had this idea that this is something that unruled rebel groups are doing, this is indeed something that states are very often responsible for. We also had this idea that militia groups were more violent and maybe used more sexual violence than states did. And we've also kind of dismantle that myth. We often find that, in fact, the regular state forces involved in a war commit as much, if not more, sexual violence than militia groups that they are sponsoring or let operate on their behalf. So we need to hold states accountable to what the atrocities that they commit. And we shouldn't think just because a state is involved in a conflict that somehow the risk of sexual violence is any less, quite the contrary. So we see this across the globe, which brings me to this other main finding, which also maybe dispels some previous myths, that sexual violence is not an African problem only, or maybe even predominantly. Sexual violence is happening and has been happening in all parts of the world. This has been another myth that we saw a lot, maybe several years ago, where there's this assumption that conflicts in Africa are different in this respect. And we don't find that in the data that we collect. We see that sexual violence is indeed happening also in conflicts other places. Now, when that's said, we do have several of the conflicts that have been taking place on the African continent where we've seen sexual violence reported to a quite high degree. So DRC was mentioned already, Sudan, South Sudan, Rwanda. There are Central African Republic, there are many cases of sexual violence being used and having been used in armed conflicts in Africa. What we see as well when we try to compare, not from this database explicitly, but from other related research, we see that sexual violence in war is often more brutal and leads to more injuries than sexual violence outside of war context. And many of the stories that have come up already in this meeting can sort of attest to why this happens. There is much more use of gang rape in wartime than outside of war. Very often we see reports of various tools and weapons being used and sort of a lot of physical injuries as part of sexual violence in wartime. So that is another part of what kind of makes sexual violence during war more different from sexual violence outside of war when we sort of take a step back. And there are many different reasons why sexual violence happens as part of war. It can be used to terrorize the population. It can be used to make people want to flee an area. It can be used as part of genocide because it affects reproduction, or it can be intended to affect reproduction. It's sometimes, or quite frequently, we also see that sexual violence is used by groups that recruit their members, armed groups that recruit their members through force. So sexual violence sometimes functions as a way to socialize soldiers together when they have been recruited by force into an armed group. So it's some way of socializing the recruits into the armed organization. And then, as I said before, sometimes sexual violence is also not specifically strategically used as a weapon and more of an opportunistic form of violence. And so we need to sort of be aware of the range of reasons why sexual violence might be happening. And then there are those groups as well that decide that sexual violence is something that they are not going to be committing, and that quite deliberately use political training and so on of their recruits to prevent sexual violence by soldiers, and to kind of make the fact that they're not using sexual violence one of the ways that they promote the cause that they're fighting for. So sexual violence can be used as a strategic weapon. The decision to not use sexual violence can also be used as a strategy in war. Now, the last thing, I'm not sure how many minutes I've left really, but there's a lot of challenges about reporting and information gathering in this area, which has been mentioned already. And we find it also in all the work that I am involved with. And so survivors of sexual violence, of course, can be worried about the stigma and social consequences of talking about the fact that they're victims of sexual violence. So that's a reason to not report for many people. And so we should be aware of that and think about ways to make reporting safe and anonymous for those who want to stay anonymous, which in many cases goes completely in contradiction with how we also would like to see people held to account and people to be able to speak up in a court of law, for example, about what's happened to them. So there's some very difficult and paradoxical challenges we face in the reporting. We should also recognize that there can be fear of retaliation when to speak up about sexual violence. So it's not only that people might feel that they worry about the social consequences for themselves when choosing to not report on sexual violence, but also because they fear being re-victimized as a result of speaking up. Very often we can also say that there's maybe no one to report to. Maybe there's no functioning health system, which I think has been the case in Tigray for the last couple of years, where the health system really is not functioning as well as it should. And so there's fewer people to report to about things that have happened. And previously, maybe less today than maybe a decade ago or 2 decades ago, there was maybe not taken as seriously as it should. So there was no one to report to that would really listen. Today, I think we've gotten quite far, although we have so many challenges, we've gotten much further in recognizing that this is something that is a big problem in war that we need to take seriously. I think a last element of the reporting problems that we are probably facing is not only that people don't want to talk about what happened to them, or that they fear doing that, or that they might not have anyone to report to, but it's also the fact that even if you do report, what happens then? If nothing happens and nothing comes of it, why would someone choose to report? We can understand that this is something that is a rational decision to not put yourself in that risk of the social consequences, the other types of security consequences, if you consider that the likelihood that someone will be facing justice or that you will be getting proper support is very low. So the continuing impunity is also a challenge for reporting on this topic. And I think the last thing that I want to mention is the importance, now that there are more people trying to document and trying to figure out how to capture what is going on with sexual violence in conflict situations, that we need to be very careful in how we approach survivors of sexual violence, making sure that they are not re-traumatized or put at greater risk because of our interest in documenting abuse and in our quest for seeking justice. So there's the Murad Code. Nadia Murad, who won the Peace Prize together with Dennis Mukwege, was part of establishing this Murad Code for how to protect survivors of sexual violence in the process of documentation and reporting. And so that's something that should be taken into consideration when someone tries to do a research project, try to gather evidence as a journalist, or in any other ways trying to talk with survivors of sexual violence in order to extract information about what happened. So with that, I think I'll leave it with that. There's a lot more to say about this. It's been very interesting to hear everyone's intervention so far, and I'm happy to talk more about the research that I do on this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ragnar. That was amazing. That was really insightful again. It's really great to know more and learn more about the database that you created and the functionalities of it. And also something that you said that really stood out for me was that sexual violence and conflict is not inevitable. It's something that can be completely avoidable, because there is this heavy rhetoric that comes from especially states who dodge accountability, that sexual violence it's almost a catalyst effect when there is a conflict, and there is no such, what you said, the research that you've conducted clearly shows that it is actually inevitable. And if there is a political will, and also a will to make sure that they are adhering to human rights laws, then there is a way of making sure that the sexual violence is not committed on the civilian population. So that's a really interesting, I think, element that you pointed out about the research that you have conducted and the pattern that is shown you. So thank you so much, Ragnhild. We would definitely have a lot of questions for you in the chat, so we will come back. I think we are now, Jacqueline, sorry, has not been able to join us due to her being in the field in Juba, and she has been trying, but her connection is really, really dire. So she may be listening, but she definitely cannot connect enough to speak. So unfortunately, she will not be speaking today, and hopefully we can have her on another panel. But just to bring it back to some of the questions, I think some of our panelists are being asked in the chat. There is a question on the African advocacy groups dealing with weaponized rape. Are there any advocacy groups that specifically deal with weaponized rape within the AU context? I know there are a lot of civil societies, but what's the ability of these advocacy groups to actually receive almost like a consultancy status with the AU system, with the AU transitional justice system and the AU system that focuses on human rights violations? And is there a platform for them to really be integrated into some of the justice provided, some of the frameworks provided by the AU? And Christine, if you could possibly try to tackle that question, that would be great. Christine, if you're with us.
Yes, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Perfect.
All right. So I will try to tackle it very broadly without necessarily getting into specific aspects. But first, at the political level, the Peace and Security Council within the African Union has a political responsibility to continuously track progress in a number of contexts where there has been breakdown, conflict context, as well as civil strife. To the extent that we are all familiar with, when things are very hot, then there is significant focus in particular country contexts. But when the situation seems to have a semblance of peace, of course, here we would speak about fragile peace or negative peace, then the political structures within the African Union's focus tend to move away. And the argument that we have had over time is that there are numerous crisis situations that they need to pay attention to, and so on. So we have the Peace and Security Council that is actually representative of state members who constitute the council on a rotating basis for 2 to 3 year terms, and that becomes a place where we could pursue advocacy. But the other is that the AU has also appointed a special advisor on women, peace and security, Honorable Bineta Diop, who again provides an avenue for advocacy with regard to the situation of women and children. We also have the UN advisor on the Horn of Africa, who's based in Addis Ababa, engaging directly with the African Union. So we're not short of political opportunities to put pressure on states to move forward. The other, with so far as accountability is concerned, of course, we have the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. As you were asking the question, Melat, I was busy trying to look up the decision that was recently passed by the African Commission on Human and People's Rights, particularly with regard to the Tigray situation. The communication was filed by Legal Action Worldwide in partnership with a number of civil society organizations who have been focused on the Tigray situation ever since it broke out. And it particularly focuses on the measures that the state needs to put in place to address the harms that have been suffered by victims and continue to be suffered by victims. Of course, as we all know, the greatest challenge across international and regional human rights mechanisms lies with enforcement. And I think it speaks to the question you were highlighting earlier, Melat. How can we entrust the responsibility for accountability, reparation, in the hands of those who are alleged to be the perpetrators themselves? And I want to then make a connection to the point that I really wanted to emphasize, on this second part of the panel, that world over, what experiences are showing us, not just now, but even in decades past, is that transitional justice processes do not succeed because of the will of the state. It succeeds because of the will of the people. Transitional justice processes, accountability, reparation for victims lies on the strength of the people who bear the brunt of the violations to demand and push and pursue until something happens. And unfortunately, the phrase that we hear time and again, that the wheels of justice move very slowly, or that eventually justice does come, bear true in a number of contexts. Let me take the example of the Hissène Habré case, for instance, who was a dictator in Chad in the 1970s. He fled, went into exile in Senegal, and the law only caught up with him just before his death. And with concerted effort of documentation by victims from the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s, you can imagine decades of documenting violations, years of trying to pursue justice in numerous courts, universal jurisdiction in Belgium, eventually in Senegal, back and forth, before the African Union itself then gave in and eventually supported the establishment of a special mechanism that held Hissène Habré accountable, including for one incident of rape, which was overturned because of technicalities. Who knew that there would be a time when President Bashir would be behind bars? His day in court has not arrived, but he's detained. And that's not because the government of Sudan was willing. It's not because the government of Chad was willing. It's because the people, victims, civil society, church movements, religious organizations have been relentless. And so I think as we speak about transitional justice frameworks, it is pertinent for us to acknowledge that they are not without the challenges, because they are developed by political actors who are keen on protecting their political interests. And therefore, while we take them as tools and resources that can help us to arrive at a point of justice, we cannot exclusively rely on the goodwill of those who draft them, of those who perhaps may have goodwill or not. But we as a people must continue to create, innovate, push, demand, and pursue until the right of our people is acknowledged and something is done about it. The sad reality is it doesn't happen overnight. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of investment, but that investment pays off for our future generations. And that's a lesson that we have learned in a hard way in Kenya. We are seeing in South Sudan. We have seen in numerous countries in Latin America, in the Latin American context. And so transitional justice is a political animal. Justice, accountability, reparation is about the politics of the day. And we must then set ourselves up to play the long game, to pursue and push hard until something comes through. And just to conclude, I like the point that Radhid made earlier about the variations in different contexts. Of course, what we have a very significant focus in sexual violence occurring in armed conflict, for instance, as distinct to sexual violence occurring, say, in situations of political strife, such as election-related violence in Kenya. Sometimes there may be a temptation to move our focus away from instances that may not seem as gross, perhaps, for lack of a better word. But I think perhaps an avenue for advocacy that exists for us to interrogate is how do we draw the nexus between sexual violence happening during peace times or in contemporary contexts, sexual violence happening in the context of political violence, and sexual violence happening in armed conflict. Whereas it's more aggravated in armed conflict for the reasons that Rainid has rightfully pointed out. The question that we must ask is, why sexual violence? What is the continuum across these different spaces that makes sexual violence, as we know and as documented against women and girls disproportionately, but also men and boys? And even when it occurs against men and boys, the gender bias checks in. The gendered nature of these violations, we must begin to pay critical attention to it, so that even outside the space of armed conflict, we can continuously advocate in as strong a way as we do in the context of armed conflict, because only when we address the underlying causes, our socio-cultural norms and beliefs, aside from perhaps the factors that might be used to prevent conflict, how do we prevent sexual and gender-based violence? How do we ensure that our messaging and our advocacy strategies can be carried across different spaces at different times and ensure that victims are able to receive reparations, remedies, but more importantly, that we can prevent these violations in every space where they occur. Thank you, Melad. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much, Christine. Again, that was very in-depth, very, I think the statement that you made about the fact that sexual gender-based violence is not just something we have to see outside of, within the context of conflict, is something that transpires from the society that has felt a sense of impunity, that has not correctly provided justice for victims, for perpetrators have not been held into account, and that transpires in a very amplified manner in conflicts. So without the society actually acknowledging and dealing with the severe acceptance of sexual gender-based violence within the society, then we cannot simply look at it as an isolated incident when it happens in conflict. So I completely resonate with that. I really feel like that's something that we really need to engage with further, because there is a lot of misconception that again, like Ragnhild has said earlier, that we in conflict it's just something that's inevitable, so that's okay. But it's not just isolated in conflict, it transpires from that society. Therefore, it's a notion that's carried by the perpetrators before the conflict even begun. So thank you so much for pointing that out. Maybe if Dr. Mioka can add on, just to simply speak about, because you said earlier about, you were speaking about the fact that the sexual violence, you said, sorry, that the re-traumatization of victims is something that is very prominent when it comes to the documentation and to the monitoring. And you've also said that there are indicators in the continental framework, but whether they have been very efficient, that's another conversation. But you said it took some time for the UN and the international community to recognize crimes of sexual gender-based violence in Tigray. Do you think that's because the systematic nature of it has actually been politicized to ensure that there is no accountability for the state?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me again. So I was listening keenly to Tina, her presentation, and I just wanted to chime in and say that it just seems to me that the African Union, I don't know how to phrase this. I would love to put it in a way that is subtle and not just acting like I'm going after them, but it just seems to me that the African Union at times is not able to really be direct with member countries when the member countries are actually committing, or their governments are committing atrocities on citizens of their nations. It seems to me like the AU has not been able to be forthright on this one, like just going straight up and saying, you know, we are uneasy with what's going on here with women and children, for example, you know, being direct. I think that that's a conversation we need to have, because, you know, we cannot have all these instruments in place to protect women in war zones, and yet this is continuing. It just seems that those people that have power that could help to stop it somehow are not able sometimes to do it because of the conflict of interest, if I could use that term. And I also wanted to bring up the question of, you know, there's something we haven't discussed in this presentation. I noted it down. I said, maybe I'll bring it up. I don't know how many of you know about MONUSCO and the stabilization force in the DRC. They were supposed to be helping bring peace in the DRC, in the Eastern DRC. And what happened is that they, unfortunately, some of their soldiers were involved in basically sexual violence against women in that country, in the DRC. I don't know how many of you are aware, if anyone on this panel is aware of this, but I can assure you there's literally research reports that have been written by people like Dr. Sabine Lee and others, you know, just basically writing about the role of UN troops in causing, you know, harm to the communities where they're supposed to be, you know, providing, you know, protection. So in the event that this is happening, how then can the UN be also playing the role of peacekeeping and trying to advocate for the rights of women? Because I feel like there's you know, when these sorts of incidents happen where, you know, UN peacekeepers commit these sorts of atrocities, you know, in many instances, they get away with it. I mean, I would love to hear a little bit of a conversation around this, because we're talking about the United Nations. They're supposed to be trying to help maintain peace in some of these regions that are disrupted by war. And you have their soldiers committing atrocities on local populations. So I feel like this is something that is really concerning, because it undermines the work of the United Nations in the places where their soldiers are supposed to be helping to maintain peace and to help, you know, because if you look at the Congo, for example, you know, the community is completely now against MONUSCO there. They don't want them, the soldiers, the peacekeeping soldiers there. They have completely lost trust. And I'm just speaking this generally to say, I mean, this could happen anywhere else. I believe it has also happened in Haiti. Those are the two contexts where I heard about this. I read reports about this. And I feel like this really undermines our struggle to try and ensure that women stay safe even during, you know, wartime. And I wonder if we might think about creating some type of organization that is outside of the AU, as African women and men that are concerned about sexual violence in war, because if we cannot have the AU support us in the critical ways that we need them to, by being able to speak out to the powers that be, then what else can we do?
And that is a very good way to end that question. I think Rita has a bit to add on the same question, if possible. Rita.
Thank you, Milad. Sorry. Yes, I just wanted to add, in terms of the AU, the African Union, we have many mechanisms. The Special Rapporteur on Women in Africa, the Special Rapporteur on Refugees, this complaint that was received by the Commission. But in order to actually address any of it, the states always have to be willing to tell the truth and work with the Commission. From the last session on the African Commission for Human and People's Rights, we saw that the Ethiopian Eritrean delegate simply denied all of the human rights abuses that they were presented with and sugarcoated it with the mechanisms that they had in place in their respective countries. We have heard repeatedly that these, you know, throughout this conversation, that we've heard that states are regular perpetrators of atrocity crimes, but these institutions like the African Union treat states as human rights promoters and defenders. States in Africa, we know, act like colleagues. They don't call each other out and hold each other to account. They defend each other and sort of scratch each other's back. So, for Tigray, who have been victims, for Tigrayans in general, who have been victims of two states, who are in complete denial of the atrocities that they have committed and who are committed to whitewashing the systematic conflict-related sexual violence that has taken place, it's almost a dead end. So going forward, unless we have civil society organizations be taken more seriously and states held to account and not babysat, these institutions won't work to promote human rights. That's all I want to add.
Thank you so much, Rita. That completely resonates with me as well, because of the frustrations I think we both hold as advocates for Tigray and the mechanisms of the AU that we did not feel like were implemented in a just manner. We didn't feel like the AU, again, like Dr. Myoka had spoken about initially, there was a politicization of sexual gender-based violence and a complete gaslighting and denial, actually, of not just the victims, but those actually advocating for the victims. And we faced a lot of pushback. So I think we are right to have reservations, but it's also I think what Dr. Myoka suggested is there possibly an entity outside of the political spectrum, the political field of the AU that would probably just concentrate on such violations without having to politicize some of the atrocities, the accountability and the justice seeking process of it all. And I think that's a question for all of us. If we can go maybe to Ragnhild, I think, for some of our last questions. You've spoken extensively about the database and what kind of observations that allowed you to have on the greater evaluation of SGBV. How do you feel like the documentation actually influences the policy making, or if it does at all, and how you feel like your database is actually being used by policymakers or those who make legislation to actually tackle some of the gaps that you are finding due to the data collection and the monitoring and the documentation that you've done via the system. If you could possibly tackle that question, that'd be great.
Yes. So I think that the database, I think, has kind of had an indirect, been helpful indirectly in that it has allowed a lot of research on sexual violence to happen that wouldn't otherwise have been possible to do. So we've seen now amongst academics, at least, that the volume of research on sexual violence in connection with war especially has skyrocketed in the last few years. So there's a lot of work being done and I think, we see how many times the database is being used in that purpose. For that purpose, it's easy to monitor. We see a lot of studies coming out using that database for various purposes to understand causes and consequences of sexual violence in war. And I think I notice how the talking about sexual violence in different international fora and so on has changed over time, and that we are somehow making more people understand and acknowledge some of these points that I was talking about, that the states are very frequent perpetrators, the variation we see, the importance of documentation, etc. So I feel like it's a slow but steady progress, but we're nowhere near where we have a solution and we can solve the problem of sexual violence in war. I also wanted to acknowledge what was said before, actually, by Tina, especially about sexual violence also outside of war. And this is something I'm really interested in as well and very concerned about. I think in addition to election violence, we also need to recognize that states often also use sexual violence and sexual harassment as part of their repressive repertoire, also outside of war. So it's not only a wartime tactic, but so it's something that I'm doing research on now that I'm hoping to publish on in the near future. So and I think it brings us to this fundamental problem that comes up in a lot of the discussions too, about the fact that the states are the perpetrators. How do we hold them to account? Because of a lot of the systems that we have are based on the states being willing to change their ways or investigate themselves. And clearly that has some problems. And the African Union, United Nations, and all these different organizations that might do some good things, they are also fundamentally organizations consisting of the governments of states. So it's hard to sort of get around that fact. And so when we're talking about sexual exploitation and abuse by peacekeepers, for example, first of all, any country that has peacekeepers on their ground, they have to be invited in. So the country where this peacekeeping is happening has to be agreed to have peacekeepers, first of all. And then in the end, different countries send peacekeepers to these peacekeeping missions, and it's up to those countries to investigate and punish cases of sexual exploitation and abuse that happens. So if a country decides it's not that important for them to fully investigate and punish crimes committed by their soldiers when they're on a peacekeeping operation, then ultimately they will not be punished. They will be sent home from the mission. They might return, they might not, but it's ultimately up to all individual countries to do this. And so there's quite a lot of sexual exploitation and abuse happening in peacekeeping operations, and there's quite a few studies also on this now. So it's another important topic to consider moving forward. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much of the time for everyone else, but those were some of the points that I thought I could say something about at least. So. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Ragnhild. I really appreciate that. I think the points that you and Christine have made about the peacekeeping, I think they are very important points, because I think from an advocacy point of view, we had initially been advocating for peacekeeping forces because of the fact that there's a lack of trust by the Tigrayan population upon the national army coming in to safeguard them, and clearly that has been agreed now, but there's still a long time before there is any trust building to be done, because accountability and justice still haven't taken place. But then there is another question, like you guys have mentioned, about the risks of having peacekeeping, and if the data is clearly showing that there is sexual gender-based violence even within the peacekeeping forces, it poses the question of how do you safeguard a victim population that has already been traumatized by further implications of atrocities bestowed upon them. So thank you so much for highlighting that both. I think we'll come back to Gabra Mescal to kind of finish off the questioning, the question section of the panel. Gabra Mescal, so you spoke about some of the work that you've been doing with the victims. I know you speak a lot about the kind of the traumatization of Tigrayan rape victims and the kind of support that they require. In your experience, do you believe that they've managed to even receive some type of psychosocial support? And how do you view the stigma that comes with the victims who have been afflicted of things like sexual transmitted diseases, unwanted pregnancies, and how can we as a community better support them to ensure that there is no longitudinal stigma that affects them psychologically?
Yeah, thanks so much, Mela, for raising this very important question. So to give some highlight as to how deep the stigma the victims of this genocidal rape have been going through, let me mention an example. Of course, I have been in direct conversation with many victims. I would prefer to use victims, of course, to highlight that they are still not surviving enough, and it also speaks volumes as to how support they haven't been given, or how serious attention they haven't been given to. In order to highlight this, I would prefer to use victims until I make sure that the international community pays serious attention to the agonies of the hundreds of thousands of Tigrayan women and girls who have been at the receiving end of this genocidal rape. So coming back to the example, when I was on the phone with a victim who was gang raped by the Amhara Fano in Western Tigray, she was fleeing to Sudan, carrying a 1-year-old baby on her back, and then the Amhara Special Forces and the Amhara Fano stopped her, and then they held her in sexual slavery for an entire night and day. And she was gang raped to the point of making her physically impaired for the time being. And then she anyway landed in Sudan after so much ups and downs. So she crossed to Sudan in December 2020, and I was on the phone with her on September 2021. You can count the number of months, maybe 9 months, I don't know. So I asked her, why did you keep quiet for 9 months or so without visiting a health center in the refugee camp? Why didn't you go and seek support? Shockingly, she told me the Amhara Special Forces and the Amhara Fano, as they were gang raping her, they took her smartphone, they took contact numbers of entire family. Of course, they took the phone for themselves, and they warned her, if you ever try to share anything about this, we'll go after every one of your family members who are back in northwestern Tigray. So she was very much traumatized, and she was terrified that if she would come to any of the health centers in the refugee camps and share her story with the health professionals, she felt that her story might, go public and land on the ears of the perpetrators, and consequently they would go after her family. So she preferred to keep everything for herself, even to the point of not visiting health center, even to the point of having no trust on health professionals. So I don't know, there cannot be any better example than this to show how much these women and girls are traumatized. And also when they try to, to share their stories with people they consider, to support them, their story or their private story in one way or otherwise gets compromised, and many people would come to know about them, and they would start pointing fingers at, oh, that lady, or that one who got raped. Even yesterday, I was on the phone with another one who was gang raped for 10 days by the Amhara Fano, another case. And yesterday, she was crying and told me that when she was at the health center, the medical doctor told her to come next day, and she was raped by security forces, Sudanese security forces, sorry. So again, this is the second rape case. One is by the Amhara force inside Western Tigray, and this one's new rape case is inside a refugee camp. I am not going to go to the details, but long story short, she happened to be at a health center in the refugee camp, and one of the health professionals, a doctor, happened to tell his colleague to inform that girl, oh, please tell that the lady who is there, who was raped, to come next day. And she was outside, she overheard him saying, using this term, the lady that was gang raped. He could have said shortly, please tell that lady to come tomorrow. But he used this term that, oh, the lady who was gang raped, please inform her to come tomorrow. And then when that colleague of his went outside and said to her, he's telling you to come tomorrow, no more talk, please. I have heard him. She returned it back. And yesterday on the phone, she was crying as she was speaking with me. So to summarize it, the trauma re-traumatization is too deep. Let me put it this way. It is too deep. That's why I'm urging the Africans as well as the international community, please, to pay serious attention. The hundreds of thousands of victims of the genocide are raped, and the African leaders are using this mockery, African solutions, African problems. That's an insult to humanity, I would say. I would dare to say that. That's a cover or sugarcoating one another's crime among themselves. They are dictatorial regimes, and to silence the people, the African people. And it's, disgraceful that we, the people of Africa, are keeping quiet until we are the next victims. So it's a point in history for all of us, Africans, civil societies, NGOs, or the people in general, to come together and challenge these dictatorial regimes. African solutions to African problems is just an escape. It's a way of escaping from accountability. So we have to come forward and tell them on their face that they have to be held accountable. And the support level, you asked me, Melat, I'm sorry to say that they haven't got the support they needed. Even in some cases when sought support, when they dared even to tell their stories with people they consider to be trustworthy, they were told, you have to abort the pregnancy if you want me to help you. That's so, disrespectful, insensitive, to say the least. To tell a victim, first you have to get the pregnancy aborted if you wish to get my financial support. Who am I to order a victim to get rid of the pregnancy in order for me to give her financial support? How? It's painful. And this lady, she is a girl, and the pregnancy, she tried her best to abort the pregnancy when it was at month 3. Unfortunately, this UNHCR official couldn't help her to get the pregnancy aborted. He told her, oh, it is better to give birth to the baby. Finally, you'll be happy once you get the, some trash thing. Anyway, she found herself at month 7, and at month 7, she finally visited a private clinic, and the doctor told her it was too late to get the pregnancy aborted. And when she shared her story with a close family, and that family, who is a woman, a Tigrayan one, told her, if you want my financial support, you have to get rid of the baby in your womb. Imagine. So to conclude, I would put it this way: the victims haven't got the amount of attention they deserve. They are still being challenged or being asked something that they can't do by those people who should have helped them, for them to heal from this unfortunate ordeal or tragic experience. I think it's words wouldn't be enough to say about that, but let me constrain myself and in here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gabra Mascal. I know how difficult it is to share, especially when it comes to testimonies, and as it is something, like you said, we can't call them survivors because are they really surviving yet? They are still victims. Have they really got the support for us to deem them as survivors? And I don't think that is the case. So I completely understand, and it's very painful to listen to this, not just as a member of the community, but also as a woman who knows the kind of stigma that comes with these kind of the sexual violence in general when it comes to our community and our society, because it still is something that's very untouched and has been not spoken about enough, I think. So thank you so much, Gabra Mascal. Thank you so much for all the work that you do as well, tirelessly, for all the support that you provide for the victims. So much appreciated. So we're kind of rounding up our discussion today. We are so grateful to all our panelists, and we hope that our audience and anyone who's watching takes some of the stuff that's been said on board. I think something that, Gabra Mascal, I know you have lost faith in the notion of African solutions to African problems, but one thing I was reminded of when the panelists were speaking was that African solutions for African problems does not have to be on only a political level. It can come down to the masses. We have to be able to take the power away from politicizing human rights violations and sexual gender-based violence in conflict and outside of conflict, and take action into our own hands. We have to be able to mobilize and start dealing and documenting things in a manner that can be monitored in a way that provides justice for the victim community. So thank you so much for the panelists for joining us today. We really do hope that you guys connect outside of the panel as well, and we can continue some of the work that you're doing independently. There's a lot to learn, I think, from each other. There's a lot that we, the Tigrayan community, can learn from all of your experiences in Kenya and Rwanda and the east of Congo, and also the databases that you've created, such as Ragnode, the databases and the systems that you have put in place to make sure that the documentation is something that's available for victims. There is still a lot of obstacles and hurdles that we have to get through in terms of providing confidentiality and not re-traumatizing our victims. But I think that the first step, like you guys have mentioned time and time again, is to be able to take the power away from the political leaders and actually give it to the masses, give it to civil societies, empower the civil societies to be able to deal with this outside of a political environment, because it has to be depoliticized. So thank you so much for joining us, panelists, and thank you so much for our audience who have been with us for the best part of 2 hours. And we hope that we connect outside of this panel and we continue the great work that you have all been doing. And thank you for all those who have joined us from wherever you're streaming from, wherever you're watching from. Much appreciated. And I would also like to thank people who have been helping in the background, such as Betty. Betty's done an amazing job in organising some of the questions, and thank you to the audience who has posed a lot of questions in the chat as well. So thank you all. I'm going to end our panel discussion now, and I hope you all have an amazing day. Thank you all.
Thank you so much.